and this is Chamomile and Clove, our All Souls podcast. This week we are talking about chapters 22 through 24 of A Discovery of Witches, and we have a lot to say about these chapters, and they're hard, guys. They're very, very hard.
Yeah, they're rough. Some rough topics that we're going to be covering, and they're tough to like our characters in these chapters. And
we've come to the conclusion that in these 3 chapters, everyone is awful except for Mart.
Except for Mart, yes. She is our guiding northern star in these chapters, our voice of reason.
So if we start from that premise that everybody is awful except for Mart, I think that that gives us a good framework for starting to talk about these 3 chapters and what they contain. For those of you who are listening in real time, we also wanted to take a minute to wish you a Happy New Year, because this episode should be coming out on New Year's Eve, so we can set the dumpster fire that was 2017 to light and let it go and start a new brave year, 2018, which, guys, is All Souls year. It's the year that we get the World of All Souls book. It's the year that we have another All Souls Con, and it's the year that we finally get the Discovery of Witches television show. So hooray and huzzah and much rejoicing for 2018.
Yay! It's already a better year.
It couldn't have gotten much worse, honestly, but that's all we're going to say about that. So, for our chapter summary, we start in chapter 22, where Matthew has gone storming off into the woods to deal with Domenico Michele, and then he comes back, and he is a very different Matthew. He is a Matthew that wants nothing to do with Diana, and he's a Matthew that is insistent that they're not going to violate the covenant, and that there will be no dancing, boys and girls, no dancing whatsoever, and that he will go back to Oxford. He will take his passport and his laptop and skitter off into the night to manage the congregation. Diana is left with Isabeau and Mart after a great deal of argument, a little bit of denial, some visions. We have a moment in the salon, and then Matthew leaves, and Diana learns, quote-unquote, what Witchwater is about. So for the first, 4 pages of chapter 23, Diana's essentially drowning in her own tears, really, truly, actually drowning. And then Isabeau and Mart take care of her. They end up telling her the story of how Matthew was made. And there are some interesting things to talk about in that portion of the chapter. Then all of a sudden, we are in chapter 24, where, in my opinion, Isabeau realizes that this whole thing is a lost cause, and she decides to take Diana hunting. And we have a very disturbing experience riding side saddle with Isabeau and watching her kill things before we come back to the house, have an edgy phone call with Matthew, and then peter off into the night. Fair?
Right. But
no, we do not Peter knocks off into the distance. We just sort of end the scene. And structurally, we've talked a little bit about how we think that this point in the book represents a midpoint and a reversal. I think that it could vie potentially with a part a little bit later for the actual lowest midpoint crisis point of the book, but it's certainly the first real pinch point that we get. And it's funny that it happens this way, where we're sort of parallel to the rest of the plot, but we're still in this moment of extraordinary tension. What do you think about it?
I think it works more as a pinch point for the romantic plot and not necessarily the main plot, because really nothing has happened with our main plot except for that we know that, as was inevitable, the congregation found out where they were.
Well, but I think that there is an argument to be made that part of the pinch point is them realizing that their relationship and the plot with the congregation in the book are not as disconnected as either Diana or Matthew wants to believe. And so I do think that there is a larger plot movement, but it has to do with the two of them realizing that they can't actually separate those things, and that their romantic relationship and the book are actually factually connected.
Yes. Yes. I agree with you. You are very smart.
I don't feel smart.
Well, do, because you are. And other than this chapter essentially landing us in the plot of Footloose, no dancing of any kind, we have
the French version of Footloose? The Isabeau version of Footloose? No
yes,
Tarantella
exactly.
at all.
Ever. No Volta either. I mean, and we do ride side saddle later, so this is basically the French country version of Footloose.
We will get to the side saddle, trust me.
It's all connected. It doesn't make sense now, but it will.
It all has to do with the protection of virtue.
Indeed. Yes. So I think, speaking of all of our characters being the worst, so Matthew starts out this chapter with like beginning us off on our trail down all of our characters being the worst. How do we feel about Matthew's actions in this chapter? Do we think that they're reasonable, appropriate, or necessary?
I mean, you ask that loaded question, and you know that
any of the above, like maybe part and part, like maybe some part of it could potentially be reasonable, but the execution is garbage.
I think that the emotions are genuine and that he's run into a place where he has terrible tools for dealing with this situation. And the situation is a combination of a thing he fundamentally can't control. Like, I don't think that Matthew, to some extent, realizes how, we talked a little bit in the first couple episodes about how I believe that Matthew has sort of been existing out of time, and he has been disconnected from the world of creatures in certain ways and sort of floating parallel to the world that he used to move in so freely. I think he's lost a great deal of his perceived or actual power. And so I think that there's a combination of him believing that he really could do something about this with just his power and influence, and not really realizing how much his standing, for lack of a word, has changed in the vampire world and the creature world at large by virtue of the fact that he has kind of stepped out of the pattern, And so I just think that he has strong emotions and panic and terrible tools, and his reaction to chaos is to clamp down.
Right. So 1,500 years, no emotional toolkit at all.
Yeah, and that's a character failing that I have trouble reconciling with other parts of Matthew.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. And I think, how long do we think that he has been disconnected from the creature world? Because we know in the past that he was like quite active with the family. Even like in this book, we know of him like being in various places in history that were important, or being sent places by the family. So how long do we think he has kind of like cut himself off from all of this stuff? Do we think it was...
My non-spoileriest answer I can possibly give is World War II.
Okay, that's a good answer. I was thinking perhaps even earlier, like maybe like 1800s-ish.
I think, given that we talk about it in these chapters, I think it's his father's death in World War II. I think that that is the moment where Matthew retreats and where we lose him.
Okay. Because I always have gotten a little bit of the feeling that it was a little bit of like a longer withdrawal, and that was kind of like, the end point, but then it might have like started prior to that. And then that was kind of like the final blow, and he was like, okay, no, done, out.
I think that's a fair read, honestly, that perhaps it started earlier, and then that's sort of the moment where he essentially disengages entirely from the family, where he goes into his mind palace, the Tower of Matthew, and separates, because the more we see of him and the more family he appears to have to rely on, family and close friends, you sort of wonder how he ends up being so alone, or seemingly alone, at the beginning of this book.
Mm-hmm. So we get kind of this whole discussion. We have a new power manifest from Diana, right? Almost at the beginning of the chapter, which is her seeing past, future, like snippets of things in time, and we don't really know what they are. None of them are terribly significant, except that they seem to be triggered by like things around her. Yes, you have a point.
I disagree.
Okay.
I actually think that the common theme of those visions is responsibility and loss. So they are tied up in moments where Diana, or the person that she is experiencing or that she is seeing, is either in a moment of tremendous grief or specifically of failure. That's kind of the common thread that I get, because we get this long sort of broken up vision of Sarah and Em telling Diana that her parents are dead. So obviously like the grief. But then we also get Matthew and his grief and loss and giving up the responsibility. We have him taking off what seems to be like a crusader type tunic and saying, I'm finished, like rejecting responsibility, but then coming back to his mother in this sort of second set of visions. And then the last one, which seems to be representative of the goddess, to me also speaks to responsibility and the potential for failure. And so that's what I get out of those visions.
Okay. I would buy that. They've never really, to me, read as being terribly connected to the present, except that they're triggered by, like, you know, environmental things. And I'm like, okay, but thematically, I see where you're going with that, and I agree. But when I, you know, have read it a few times, and I'm just like, it doesn't jump out at me as things that are, like, connected necessarily.
And I think what I don't especially care for them, even if I find them to be thematically significant, because there are other times in this book where we touch on Diana's visions, and it's not this explicit. I find that this in and out thing that we're doing is very disruptive, and it neither serves nor breaks the tension of what is going on in real time.
Yeah. It's very cinematic, though, when you're reading it. So it'd be interesting to see if it's something that they replicate for the TV show just because it is so cinematic. But yeah, in the book, it kind of slows things down more than anything.
Well, and maybe, intentionally or not, maybe it is preparing us for the mental and emotional space that we're getting into before we get to the Witchwater. So it is prepping us for the idea that Diana is having these incredibly strong emotions and associations, and that she is utterly powerless to stop them. So I think that it ends up somewhere, but I'm not really sure. I'm not sure that in the course of the series we actually revisit this kind of visioning again and in this particular way. And so I wonder sometimes too if it's an artifact of an earlier writing process or an earlier understanding of what Diana's visions or her extrasensory perception type powers would look like.
Potentially. Or just, I mean, since it's here in the text, I guess it could be like, because this is the first time she's experiencing them, perhaps the sensory experience is different than in the rest of the time she will have them.
I just think that this chapter, the underlying threads of the conversation are really about responsibility, both personal and social, and about choice and failure and loss. I think that's what's going on in this chapter, and everyone is talking at cross purposes, but the worst of the bunch is Matthew, followed very closely by Diana, because I think Diana makes a lot of assertions, and she makes a lot of emotional assertions, particularly in this chapter, that while I don't necessarily find them hard to swallow because it is a romance and I can go along with it, they just seem to come out of thin air.
We also have a brief phone call with Sarah.
Yes, I wanted to talk about that a lot.
And this is the one where Diana blames them for not telling her about the congregation in the covenant and any of that.
Yeah, so I want to talk about like the funny, the little sort of mirroring thing we do there on page 279 in the mass market paperback copy. So there's this moment, a beat where Diana says, "There's nothing wrong, I'm with Matthew." And Sarah says, "Being with Matthew is what got you into this trouble in the first place." So turning personal responsibility back on Diana, you cannot deny that the choice that you made to do this thing is what has landed you in this situation. And he's not all sunshine and rainbows. Like, this is a complicated and dangerous figure. So we have that little moment of bouncing and coming away. And then a couple paragraphs later, Diana gets indignant about the covenant, and Sarah says this thing about her turning back on her power, which is not, I think, entirely fair. And I'd like to unpick that for a little bit.
Well, I think it's a bit similar to a lot of the conversations we've had between Diana and Sarah in particular, which is, like, neither of them are wrong, but neither of them are right either. Like, yes, Sarah and Em didn't tell her about all of these important things, but also she did decide that she wanted nothing to do with any of this. So, yes.
But Sarah's the adult. And Sarah was the responsible adult party dealing with a traumatized child. Diana's insistence that she turn her back on her power is no excuse for not telling her how the world works. You know, it's the kind of thing where it's like, yes, Diana's choice not to engage with her identity and not to fulfill her birthright as a witch is the decision of a broken kid. And it is reckless and dangerous, and she doesn't even realize how dangerous it is. She seems to think she can just put the magic in a box and forget about it like it's a choice. And yet at the same time, I do feel like not explaining the way the world works as the adult speaks to Sarah's own trauma more than anything else. Like, I don't think that it was right necessarily, but I also think that that stems from how painful it was for Sarah to lose her older sister.
Right. Yeah, and I can definitely buy that. I think Diana, as an adult, Diana gets to take blame for continuing to not be interested in knowing anything about anything.
Right. Except manuscripts. She knows
so many things.
Fudge ton about manuscripts.
And she knows how to do her fictitious laundry with magic. So there you go. So I think, again, I like between the two of them, I think Sarah is being the more reasonable of the two. I think Diana is being very emotionally driven and not very rational at all.
And that, too, I think speaks to her trauma. Like, when I try to give her the most generous read I can based on the text in this chapter, she has developed a strong and instantaneous emotional connection to Matthew. And she is confronted with a loss that she hasn't experienced since essentially her parents died, because it's the first time she's really emotionally imprinted on anyone. And I can buy that she is absolutely wallowing and that she's spiraling out of emotional control, which is, obviously part and parcel with the visions and the Witchwater and everything that we get in this. So while I think that she has been ignorant to the point of irresponsibility, I do also think that her emotional trauma is singing the melody here.
Right. Yeah. So going back to Matthew and his choice in this chapter, do we think then that he's while he's not executing this particular scenario very well, do we think that he's making the right choice based on Diana's emotional state and kind of like this sort of like hard to swallow, like emotional obsessiveness that like suddenly pops up in this chapter?
Between both of them, actually.
Yeah. It's really difficult because I'm like, okay, in the best reading of it, to have like a healthy relationship, you have to be able to leave the people that you love and have it be fine. Right? For whatever reason, you have to be able to leave. And it's not even permanently, like that is fairly explicit in the chapter. Like, he's not leaving her forever. He's just leaving for a little bit to fix something. And in a healthier emotional relationship, that is not a problem that we should be having.
And clearly, like, parts of Diana's psyche and Diana's powers and everything else about Diana is magnifying that. But it's also pretty clear that he has decided that he's going to put a stop to it. Like, he's emotionally invested enough that he's absolutely going to put a stop to it, and that after he makes sure that Oxford is safe, they will no longer see each other. Like, he will be done with this as best he can, I think.
I don't read it as that. I read it as like a more temporary kind of situation. He does say like we won't ever break it, but I'm not sure I buy that. I think he's just trying to tell himself that, and
Do you think that he is frightened enough by Domenico that he starts going back into the emotional state that he was with Hamish, where he's in a great deal of denial about what's happening to him?
I think potentially, yeah. Because he came, he's like, we're going to the fortress in France. Like, we are going to be safe. So either he was lying to himself then, or now he's, like, in denial because, like, oh, it wasn't actually safe. Like, they found me. It's hard to say. It's difficult to say.
It is difficult to say. I would say that I think that the instinct that told him to take her to France was a combination between his inherent sort of arrogance plus the skill set that he does have, where he just like manages things into a corner and then assumes that so long as he's got his fingers like smushed firmly on the problem, it won't spiral out of control because he's had great success with that over the course of 10 centuries or so. Complicated, I think, both by the fact that this is the first time. I do think that the de Clermont are weaker now than they were before, and that's not really something we've talked about, and I don't think that we will really get into it until much later, but that the de Clermont family was sort of gilded and strong and incredibly powerful while Matthew's father was alive, but has perhaps diminished because Isabeau hasn't left Septour, and Matthew has been off doing Matthew things, and everyone else is scattered. And so I think that he's operating in some ways both off of the emotional impulses that come from the mating drive, and then also off of a fundamentally flawed set of assumptions about what will work.
So putting their emotional states aside, some things that happen in this conversation that they have are very inexcusable.
Downright awful.
Yes. Which one do you want to start with? Do we want to talk about the death threat, or do we want to talk about something else? Should we just get it out of the way?
Well, so before we get to that, I would like to point out that this does not excuse Matthew's behavior in any way, shape, or form, but Diana is deliberately provoking a couple times here to try and get an emotional reaction out of him. Like her recklessness and her stubbornness and her emotional, like her anxiety and panic is causing her to be like, to poke at things for purposes of getting a reaction that shows that he's not going to abandon her. And I think that puts us...
She definitely gets a reaction.
Right, and I think that puts us in very dangerous ground. Not her fault, not anything that takes responsibility away from Matthew, not at all. It's just recognizing the emotional...
immaturity that they both have.
Emotional immaturity, but also like the really dangerous place that we're in, where she has adopted this mindset that it is worth engaging in this extraordinarily volatile space to get emotional confirmation of a thing that is really also very dangerous. Does that make any sense? Like, I certainly don't, I never want to be in a position where I say that anyone under any circumstances is asking for inappropriate behavior or asking for threats or asking for violence. Not at all. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that I think that her trauma is also causing her to look for a reaction. Like, she's not entirely healthy in this situation either, and I can excuse her. I probably can't excuse him. I feel like that was really convoluted. Did you follow me?
I did. Yeah. And it does have the ring very much of like school kids almost, like on the playground, you know, and you like punch somebody to like get their attention, but like punching somebody is never okay. But whatever reaction they have to you punching them is on them. Yes.
It's a tough thing to talk about, right? And it's certainly something that could be extraordinarily triggering for somebody who is reading this and might either see themselves or an emotionally dominating partner in this other role. And the thing that I really don't like about both of them is the obsessive emotional attachment and the inability to separate their identity one from the other at this point.
Right. Yes. And neither of them is in a healthy relationship space or in a healthy emotional space with each other or with the rest of the world around them.
Or with themselves. I mean,
there's no point in this conversation where anybody is healthy.
And I think that there's a place for that in fiction, to talk about like really damaged people trying to find redemption and trying to find their way back to each other. I think that the thing that sets both of us off is the tone with which it is treated, because we are deep in Diana's damaged psyche, that this is somehow
okay.
I wouldn't say romantic is
no.
right. That's not what I'm looking for. But that this does not trigger alarm bells for Diana the same way that it does for me, I think, or for anybody else reading that series of passages.
And this is just like the first instance of this that we get to talk about in this book. There are definitely going to be some other ones that we're going to encounter. I think for their relationship, just like in terms of character development and writing, I think making them this unhealthily attached and obsessive is a mistake that we have to reconcile for the rest of the series. I don't think it's necessary for either of them, and certainly when we get to Matthew's story in a few pages in the next chapter, making him this obsessive is not necessary, and I think it's a big mistake.
Right. And especially because the moments when they are at their best is when they are challenging one another, not being obsessed with one another. Like when they are pushing one another to be better people, which I think at the end of the arc we are getting there. Like we are beginning to show them develop some healthier tools, and they certainly, in places in this book and in others, they have shown a capacity for the kind of behavior that creates emotionally healthy relationships. But this scene stretches it. This scene really puts you in a position where I kind of think that the next like 5 or 6 chapters, some of the things we do here are a little bit, not just a little bit, they're kind of unforgivable. And they are remarkably dangerous both for the character and then also for the message they send. And that's not to say that I don't still love the story. I think that we have the capacity to look at this with a critical eye and say that overall, like, the reason that I'm here for Matthew and Diana is because of the moments where they're being their best selves and where they're capable of their best selves and the world that they've created. But there are moments where it's like, this is not a great model.
No. And I think the reason I'm saying that it's a big mistake, and obviously like it's already in there and we have to deal with it and talk about it, but the reason it's a terrible mistake is because, like you said, we spend a lot of time trying to make it okay when it's not. We try to excuse it when it's not excusable, or we try to fix it and spend all this time fixing something that we wouldn't have had to fix if it wasn't there at the first place. And we already at this point have like bought into Matthew and Diana. We don't need this to happen.
So here's a question. I think that there are two sides of this. Like, I'd like to return to the idea of, do we have to do this because of the vampire trope? And if so, why do we do it when so many other vampires that we see or have seen in this book aren't doing this?
I don't think we need to do it, although it is present in much of vampire fiction. We've already discarded a lot of other elements of vampire fiction, so this could be discarded easily as well, I think. And I think that you're right. A lot of the other vampires in the book do not suffer from this particular malady, so I don't know why we're doing it. It's really hard for me to like find a reason for it, and I don't think there is one. And I'm certainly not going to excuse it because I think it sets a terrible example.
And I think that we could, when we attempt to retcon this behavior much later, without spoilers, if we had started there, among the many things that we could have talked about important things about relationships between creatures and stuff you ought to know. Of all the things that we could have had a discussion about, like the important things that you need to know, that retcon could have come here. I'm not entirely sure why we wait, but that's a discussion for another time. That would be helpful here. And it would also be really important to know for a mating or marriage bond. Where are Matthew's ethics now, y'all? And that's so, but I have this question about whether we kind of have to do some of this for the vampire thing. Like, is this part of doing vampire fiction, or is this Matthew specific? Because I think within the argument of the text, it might be Matthew specific, and that's almost more problematic, right?
It's worse.
That's where the hitch is, because if this is not about just vampires, and it's about the Matthew vampire, then the Matthew vampire has some stuff that he needs to get sorted before he can really truly be in the kind of relationship that he aspires to with Diana.
Right. Yes. And we have not actually met very many male vampires yet, but I mean, regardless, male or female vampires, Matthew is the only one so far who has this problem.
And I think that it's the kind of thing where, you know, when we talk about a series like Outlander, like one of the issues that you have with Jamie as a male character is that when Jamie does inexcusable things, the text glides over them because he's Jamie and he can't possibly do inexcusable things.
Or retcons them frequently as well.
True. But when another character does the exact same thing, they're a villain and Jamie is not. It's almost worse in this instance because there aren't any other characters who are doing what Matthew is doing.
Right. Currently.
And yet we are... currently, but we are still treating it as though it is somehow okay because Diana, from a position of, I believe, unhealthy, emotional isn't sorting that out. And it makes me, on further reads, much more sympathetic with Em and Sarah than I was the first time when I was swept up in the romance.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yes. And I'm just going to take a moment to insert here. Y'all do not at us about Outlander.
Sorry.
Please don't.
Sorry. This is all my fault.
No. It's good to have the comparison with other works of, like, romantic works of fiction.
It's the closest analog I have found.
Yeah. And we know a lot of our listeners have also read Outlander, and we're not trying to, like,
stir the pot. We're not stirring any pots. We're simply
no. We're just making
an analogy. We're having a literary discussion. It's a one-way ticket to Blocksville if you add us about Outlander, because we don't want to talk about Outlander, even though I just spent like 5 minutes doing so. So maybe I'm a liar.
We want to talk about it when it's helpful.
Correct.
To our discussion.
Correct.
Okay. So, in addition to the super unhealthy emotional things happening in this conversation, we also have an incredibly cavalier attitude about killing humans.
I was about to get to that, and I think that it's actually like the place where I have double starred here, because I actually think Matthew is being his most reasonable, is when he draws that line for Diana where he's like, saying that I've killed humans and understanding what that means are two different things. And he puts like, he doesn't even put a fine point on it. He's just like, this is what you think, this is what it means, confront it. And she's like, nope.
Yeah, I shall not. I shall continue to be cavalier about it like I have been.
But I think that those three, so we have that first comment saying that I've killed humans and understanding what that means are two different things. And then we have, I know who you are and you don't know yourself. And I think that those three things are actually really symbolically important. I think that those are like three of the most important lines of text in this entire chapter, because what it illustrates, at least in my reading, is the gaps in their understanding of each other, and particularly Diana's understanding, but also one of the things that makes her character, and I think keeps the romance going, is her capacity to believe in Matthew's redemption, and to believe that not only is he redeemable, he has already been redeemed. Now, that may be an extraordinarily optimistic view of things, but that doesn't mean it's not meaningful. And him being able to say, by the same token, you are damaged and don't know yourself, and you are playing with things beyond your control. And while that's one part paternalistic and also one part true, it is him recognizing and trying to say, no, you do actually need space to deal with this. You can't run from it anymore, which is one of the fundamental things about Diana, is not running from all of who she is. Right.
And I think him saying to her, you don't know yourself, how can you possibly have a good read on any of this, is really important, and one of the only rational things that comes out of anyone's mouth in this whole conversation. And it's important, and it's unfortunate that it gets buried in all of the garbage that we have to deal with. Because that is true. She is discovering herself. And so making this type of emotional connection at a point in your life when you don't know who you are and when you're finding out all of these new things about yourself and you're discovering, who you are and creating your identity or solidifying your identify is very difficult to make good relationships during that time.
It's difficult to make good choices, and that's not to say that you can't do it. It's to say that you have to do it with an extraordinary amount of self-awareness that Diana so far has demonstrated she's not capable of exercising yet. You have to be aware that you are emotionally vulnerable and that you are, for lack of a better term, like limpiting onto the first emotionally available. There's a potential for that. So I'll qualify and say that's not always what happens, but there, particularly when you have been in as unhealthy a relationship with yourself, not to mention an unhealthy relationship with somebody else, and you finally manage to emerge from it and start to make choices for yourself, every choice feels liberating. Every choice feels right. Every choice feels like sprouting your wings, and some of them are running straight into a brick wall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And between the two of them, they both have unhealthy relationships with themselves, as we have talked about before. They both have had unhealthy emotional relationships with other people. Matthew, at least, has the self-awareness to point it out. Diana does not.
Well, he has had 1,500 years to think about it.
Yes.
So if he didn't, that
would be hard to swallow.
Have that self-awareness. Yeah, I don't think that I could stand.
You
Matthew.
would just have to accept that he was emotionally stunted.
That can't stand Matthew, and that's fine. That's fine.
It's okay.
What do we think Isabeau is doing during this awful next scene where Matthew decides to physically overpower Diana, and I hate it?
What, she's just sitting there on the couch? Well, she does tell him to knock it off, but he doesn't listen, right?
So I wonder, based on...
Stupid Matthew. Sorry, I can't do French accent at all.
Stupid Matthew. Matthew, put Diana down. Now is not the time to teach her, Matthew. Anyways, so there's a part of me that feels like Isabeau should be more active here. That'd be great. Really.
Yeah, I think she's enjoying it a little bit because she's kind of still in that space where she's not on board with Matthew and Diana, and she hasn't figured out what Diana's about yet. And so I think a lot of what she's doing in the background is observing and being like, what will she do now?
Do you think she's really unconcerned?
I don't, I think potentially she is unconcerned.
Yeah, but so Diana's read on the situation is that Isabeau is unconcerned about what's happening.
I think she potentially actually is unconcerned. And I think Mart is, to some extent, Mart, sees that everybody's being ridiculous, as we discussed. She's the only person who is sane in these 3 chapters.
She also has so few lines, it makes me upset.
I know. Did she go get wine during this conversation? She's supposed to be there. Mart, you're letting us down.
She's sitting there with popcorn. Come on, Mart.
She's deep in her book in the other room. I think that she is legitimately unconcerned. And I think since this is basically a replication of the scene that we've already had, and I don't think that we need to repeat it again, except that it feels more dangerous than last time, the scene that we already had in Matthew's apartments.
And I think that it feels more dangerous because Diana has actually noticed a change in Matthew, and that they've actually been arguing before this starts, which is what makes it worse. It's bad enough in the first one that Matthew's unpredictable, and we've already talked about how that scene could have been improved to make it less problematic. This one, then, when there's actually a heated exchange of words and where they're disagreeing and he physically overpowers her with an audience. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, now this is a time when Kate reveals what she does for a living. So I prosecute sexual assault and domestic violence, and I find this scene...
Tell us, Kate. Yay!
Thanks.
I'm yaying you.
But I find this scene to be really troubling for those reasons. Understanding that fiction and true real life and the real experiences of real victims and real people are very different from fiction, and I'm not here to talk about those. I'm simply going to say that the kind of behavior that the fictional Matthew is displaying, that is, the willingness to display physical dominance in front of an audience, is a huge red flag that is really difficult.
It's like a red blanket, really.
Which is really difficult for me to reconcile with the urbane, sophisticated vampire thing.
Mm-hmm.
And generally, I like the All Souls trilogy vampires. And the one I have the hardest time swallowing is actually Matthew. And that makes him in some ways like a great male main character, because he's difficult and he's knotty and complicated and dark, and we have to sort of work with him. But there are some knots that are like really hard to unpick, and it's really hard to find redemption where he does this.
Right. Because something like this, from a writing perspective, damages your character, somebody who you're supposed to be buying your heroine ending up with. I mean, no spoilers or anything, but like, you're supposed to be, so doing this amount of damage to his character is like, so you have to reconcile with it the entire time. Not to mention, like, yes, like, truth is no defense, no condemnation of fiction. This is a fictional book, but having this behavior in there and having everybody be okay with it is not okay. There needs to be somebody in there in this book, and we'll get somebody later, but right now we don't have anybody who's like, hold on.
And again, like, I get the feeling that we could have, especially if the reconfiguration and contextualization of Matthew was planned all along, right? We could have used some of that here. And it's worth talking about the fact that consent in this book is much broader than just the idea of sexual consent, because of the idea of the covenant and the idea that all creatures are already bound to a law that they did not get a chance to choose voluntarily. It's just forced upon them, but it is also enforced. And therefore, when you are in a position where you have more knowledge than somebody else and you're about to break the law and nobody knows that you're breaking the law, there are things you ought to tell them so that they can make an informed choice about, like, how to be.
So it's really more, it's like lifestyle consent.
Or just like having all the facts to make informed choices about, like, what kinds of risks you want to take with your life. And the problem here, I guess, is that Diana fundamentally thinks that she knows what kind of risk she is taking. And that is simply being in a romantic relationship with a vampire. But there's so much more. There's so much more.
But she doesn't, yeah, and there's so much more, and she doesn't know, she thinks she knows the risks that she's taking. She doesn't, whether she's in denial about it or not. And she has this whole line in there where she's like, oh, you won't hurt me, you know, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, garbage. You don't know that.
But so here's the question, right? Like, squaring with one of the other difficult things, right? Which is Matthew's paternalism. And the fact that he's really bad to sort of like steal Diana's agency and blame it on being a vampire. Who should tell Diana the things? And would we be angry in a situation where Matthew told Diana the things, or that somebody else told Diana the things that Matthew didn't?
I think, based on the danger to her life at this moment, literally anybody should tell her the things. Tell her all the things. Like, she is literally in danger. Like, please, somebody tell her what is going on.
Do you think that the text is trying to tell us that she's not actually in danger because if she were, Isabeau would be reacting differently? Or is it that Isabeau knows Matthew well enough not to add tension to an already bad situation and she is actually worried?
I think it's the latter. Yes. Option 2.
So I think that the text is trying to tell us A when the answer is actually B.
Yeah. And I think between our two, like, between this scene and the one that we already had in Matthew's rooms, I mean, aside from the fact that we already know, I don't think we need to repeat that particular scenario, this is the least successful between the two. Not that the other one was good, but this one treads over the line into being incredibly problematic and just wrong.
I think it's actually, I mean, for me, I think it's probably the worst, like the most difficult, most problematic, the sort of like, I would pitch this into a fire scene in the book.
Anywho, do you have any last comments on it before we move on?
Well,
I have a gem that I want to talk about. Go.
Well, so, I mean, I think that then we have Diana being like, I know you're being really awful, but also I love you.
It's too late. I'm already in love with you.
Help. And I love, like, let's not get this wrong, boys and girls,
No.
ladies and gentlemen, listeners of all persuasions.
We love these books.
We absolutely love these books. This is just the point where, like, they are sort of like, where they're stretched into their most grotesque moment, really, is in these 3 chapters, and I have a lot of trouble getting behind these moments in the story. The overall arc of the story, the people that are involved, the people that Matthew and Diana become, I am 100% on board. This moment, and maybe this nadir, exists so that we can grow from it, but I don't have to like it.
Mm-hmm.
What about this business? I don't know that it's his attitude towards women that needs an overhaul. I don't know that that's fair.
I don't think it's fair either. And we talked about it, I mean, not for quite a few chapters since we had, our discussion with Chris about his attitude towards women. I don't think that's what it is. I don't know. I think that's implanted in there to, like, cause us more difficulty, and it's not. It doesn't work.
So what I think it's there to do is, I think that the least successful thing that happens with Diana in these couple chapters is that we're trying to present her as somebody who is capable of being strong, independent, self-aware, capable, caring, nurturing, but mostly like strong and independent. And we fall into this place where she says sort of a throwaway thing about Matthew's relationship with women, when it's really more like Matthew's relationship with her needs an overhaul. It's not women in general, it is specifically her.
Right. And she is, like, we've been saying how she is often passive. In this chapter, she is very active, but, like, in the wrong ways. And she has this whole comment where she's like, no.
That makes her sound really critical.
No, has...
It's okay. It's like the two of us have like picked up oars to like distance ourselves from the rest of the fandom, and we're just like rowing hard in the opposite direction.
If we had like a good chapter in the middle of this, it wouldn't be so bad, I think. But then she says all of these things where you're like reading it and you're like, what? Where is this? This doesn't make any sense. And then she has this whole thing where she's like, fine, leave. But you need to leave because you need to decide how you feel about me. And I'm like, what? What? That is not why he needs to leave.
We also get that very French, like, you know how I feel about you. No, I don't. You tell me when you are ready. And it's very film noir.
Yeah, it is. After this, like, whole conversation, I'm like, okay, well, I think some people weren't paying attention during the last 20 pages of all this discussion we've been having. If this is the conclusion we've come to before he leaves. What? Now he's leaving on some sort of, like, love self-discovery?
No, he's leaving because there's, like, a literal threat to your life and potentially his family, and, like, he's got some territoriality and possessiveness issues, like...
Right, and so, to bring this back in and make it constructive a little bit, do we think this is her denial kicking in again?
Which part of the denial?
Just like her going into like full-on denial mode, like, oh, he's not leaving because of Peter Knox, because of the threats, he's just leaving because he needs to figure out how he feels about me. And I'm going to like give him the space to do that and be a modern woman.
So, I actually think that it's...
I'm just trying to like frame it in the best possible, most character-driven way.
So, I think that there is... constructively more going on there. Okay, I'm going to unpick this as rationally as I can. One of the things I think is going on in this chapter is like Diana and Matthew being like emotionally unhealthy towards each other. That's number one. We've discussed that ad nauseum. Number two, Matthew and Diana being in denial generally about the connections between their relationship and what the congregation is actually looking for. And then also the book and the fact that you cannot they cannot make a decision about each other without implicating these other things and taking responsibility for the choice that they make, in the sense that knowing what they know about the congregation and the book and what we already believe the book to be, that puts people like Em and Sarah and Mart and Isabeau at risk. And the undercurrent there, not to mention like Matthew and Diana personally at risk, I think the undercurrent there is that when we talk about responsibility and grief in the All Souls trilogy and what kinds of choices they are making, they're the kinds of choices that can result in utter failure and the loss of people that they love. And that's what we're doing in the background underneath this like sort of wave top, lovey-dovey, push me, pull you emotional thing. That's what I think.
Okay, that was very rational. Thank you.
Was it?
Yeah.
Oh.
I think perhaps we should move on to the Witchwater before we ruin it.
Well, what I understand for this chapter is that Witchwater ruins everything.
Witchwater just ruined. I mean, especially the carpet, but...
Especially the carpet. And we know how the de Clermont feel about the carpets.
Ooh, all their decor. It's a good thing she goes up then to the top of the tallest tower to do the Witchwater.
Where she just, like, Witchwaters all over the Matthew Museum. So, what do we think of, like, the Witchwater as metaphor?
I really like it, and I'm gonna say, I know we are trying to be constructive about these chapters. I know we have been incredibly critical about the previous chapter. I will say in this chapter, I love the imagery of the Witchwater. I think the entire scene as it plays out is very evocative and beautiful, and the descriptions of the Witchwater and how this manifests is really, beautiful and terrible. And this is, by far the strongest display of magic that we have had from Diana in the book. And of course we can talk about why that is. So I like it conceptually, and I like how it's executed, while I do not like anything that came before it.
So one of the things I actually like is that it demonstrates that when Diana isn't around Matthew, and then when they're both not being the worst, she actually has some decent perspective. Like the beginning of chapter 23, where she talks about being frightened, and where she is like, I just vowed to fight for him against enemies I didn't know about or couldn't possibly understand. And it was clear that, like, Matthew being a vampire isn't just about books and nice wine. It is also about the fact that, like, he's been alive for centuries. He has enemies. He has killed before, and I am in over my head. So I like the Witchwater as a metaphor for being overwhelmed. I like it as a metaphor for the all-consuming nature of sudden grief. I like it as a metaphor for Diana's lack of control over her own trauma. And I like, in particular, that Isabeau saves her from it. That's maybe the best thing about the Witchwater to me, is that Isabeau bridges the gap between witch and vampire to pull her back from the brink, which she claims to sort of do for Matthew's sake, but I don't think it is. I think it's because Isabeau is fundamentally decent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So from a character perspective, the reason that Diana becomes so unhinged is because, as we talk about, she is like emotionally imprinted on somebody for the first time since her parents. While this is not a permanent absence, so it's a little bit absurd that they're treating it as though it were, but seeing it through the character's perspective, how that could be incredibly devastating given the emotional state that she is in. And that is the only way I can kind of reconcile having this degree of emotional reaction to a significant other leaving. And that is the nicest thing I can say about about her having the reaction, not about the reaction itself. The Witchwater is great and lovely and wonderful, and I like it. But taking it in the context of just like viewing it as a relationship, if you view it as having this kind of reaction to your significant other leaving temporarily is very unhealthy, which I feel like we talked about at length before in the but again, just because she's actually having the reaction to it now, the only way I can reconcile it is by like looking at her past trauma and the the emotional turmoil she's been going in with having that all dredged up again.
And I sort of think, I don't know that it's a reaction in my read to Matthew leaving as Matthew leaving, but Matthew as the only way that she has been able to talk about, reconcile, and otherwise manage her identity crisis. Like Matthew as the person who explains this to her, as the person who helps her sort of like stabilize herself. And that kind of emotional interdependence certainly isn't great and isn't healthy. But as a traumatized person going through this emotional resurgence, I can buy that the loss of the only person who seems to help it make sense to you would trigger or would lower your guard such that this is what happens.
Right. And a little bit too, like the loss of safety. Like Matthew is the only person that has made her feel safe or has helped her to be safe during this book. And so, and knowing what we know about her past and, you know, this anxiety and this, you know, state of fear, and the reason she's distanced herself from creatures is because of, you know, the fear and the danger. And so having her safety net suddenly removed is also, you know, quite a good reason to have this emotional reaction.
So she has the emotional reaction, and then Isabeau pulls her out of it with Mart. And the thing I like so much about those couple pages is the competency, the maternity, the matter-of-factness with which Isabeau and Mart bring her back from the brink.
What do you think about the decision not to tell Matthew about, like, all of this stuff that happened? Do you think it's fine? I mean, he keeps plenty of secrets, and I'm not saying it's, like, tit for tat. Like, keeping secrets just because somebody else keeps secrets is not a good way to live, but... like, I can see, like, there's really no point in him knowing, I guess. Right. Except he might come back, and we know how that would go, so.
What would it do? I don't know. I mean, one of the things that I don't actually like about Matthew and Diana over the course of the series is that they consciously make these decisions to be like, oh, well, he doesn't need to know about that. She doesn't need to know about that. We're just gonna talk about that later. Which, hey, not saying it's not realistic, because... I have a life partner, you have a life partner. Sometimes you're like, I'm going to reduce the impact of this until I have an opportunity to talk about it like a rational human.
Yes. It's called crisis management.
But the fact, like, I mean, it's both very real that people, like, crisis manage their partners, and also, like, it's not the best thing we do as humans. It's not.
No. It's really... And sometimes... we are all human, and sometimes you forget that you're going to talk about a thing with the other person, and you're like, oh yeah.
About that.
That's a thing about that. So I totally buy, like, sometimes we don't talk about these things, and then they come up later, and then, you know, we get some drama. But I think that's more realistic than some other parts of the book.
Shall we talk about Matthew's making and fragility?
Yes. Yes. Okay, but I would also like to say, you know how we mentioned the whole tales to tell thing, and we have like several mentions of it in these like couple of chapters, but then our boo Izzy Boo basically goes and tells Matthew's story like it's her story, and I'm like, okay, so like this is just my first example of it being like a really like not a hard and fast rule. It's very much more like a guideline than...
Although, do we think that the exception is that it's also Isabeau's story because of the role she played in it?
I guess, but she goes back to like his pre-vampire life as well, which I feel like is not... But then...
And presents it as a bedtime story.
Right, but then we also, at this point, have to ask ourselves, would Matthew ever tell Diana about this? I mean, at this point in the book, my feeling is no. My inclination is to be like, well, no, if Matthew's not going to tell her, nobody's going to tell her, so she might as well.
She might as well.
But I don't know why then we make a big deal about, like, the whole tales to tell thing. It just doesn't make sense to me, but anyway.
Yeah. Do we think that Isabeau calls Diana fragile because she believes that Diana is fundamentally broken in some way? Because I don't think... Diana makes it all about her physicality, but I don't think that that's what Isabeau's talking about.
I think she's talking about, like, her psyche. Like, she is fragile. She's emotionally fragile. Her psyche is fragile at this point. She's not physically fragile, you know, but she's just in this place where she is very... where things could certainly swing either way for Diana. I think Diana takes the wrong read on it. What do you think about Matthew's origin story?
I think that Matthew presents in that origin story as being remarkably self-indulgent.
And again, obsessive, and I don't want to say mature, not capable of a mature emotional relationship, because I'm not sure mature is the right word. He's not capable of like a healthy emotional relationship so far in what we've seen. And this is just another example. With women, not with with women, with significant others.
I think that he is prone to repetitive thought and emotional patterns, and that he has a lot of difficulty breaking emotional attachments and or not focusing on really negative pathways. That's a lot of psychobabble to say that like he just can't let a thing that hurt him go. He keeps poking it.
Yeah. He keeps poking it. But then he also, has a tendency to repeat behavior that has hurt him in the past. So
he's not really good at learning.
A little bit.
When it comes to this particular set of behaviors.
Yeah. And we learn about his first wife and his son, both of whom, now deceased, but they would have been anyway unless they had also been turned into vampires. And I have to say, 1,500 years is a really long time to feel bad about something like this.
To perennially feel bad about a thing. And maybe I'm being unfair because I haven't lived 1,500 years. Maybe there are decisions that I have made that I would feel badly about 1,500 years later, but I'm not sure. And do you think it's curious that Isabeau does this whole thing where she's like, I've never been sure that I did the right thing in making him a vampire? I think that's really curious.
I don't think it makes sense to me because we've had all of this talk about consent and being turned into a vampire and blah, 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 blah. Is it consent if the person you're turning into a vampire is hallucinating and thinks you're John the Baptist and Mary coming to no.
Probably not.
The answer is no. So I can see how she's the
prosecuting person in me says that hallucinating people can't give consent.
Yeah, no. I think
not capable.
A lot of people. Yeah, so it makes sense to me that she has enough perspective on it to be it wasn't really the best call because he was not in a place where he could make that decision.
Well, also when she describes him being in a rage because he was a vampire, it's pretty clear, and maybe that is why we see Matthew with Marcus
being much more careful.
And having such a defined and particular sense of ethics. I mean, it's pretty clear that Isabeau and Philippe made a point of raising Matthew correctly, even if they're oops, our bad. But, maybe the source of Matthew's ethics is actually his trauma over being accidentally vampirized.
Or not so much accident, but just, vampirized without his full and knowing consent. And vampirized when he turning somebody into a vampire when they're already in that emotional state where they potentially probably intended to kill themselves or, do harm to, and when they're already in this state of grief, and then turning them into a vampire forever, when they're already in that emotional state, doesn't ring of good choices to me.
No, it certainly doesn't. And then Isabeau makes some very questionable choices in terms of talking to Diana about becoming a vampire. And, Diana's fragile, but she doesn't appear to be fragile enough to be that seems like a great idea.
Because we know that, and Matthew has already stated, that's not what he wants. That's not what Diana wants. He doesn't want to change her into what he is. He just wants her to be as she is.
Warts and all.
And I'm kind of curious if this is a test on Isabeau's part or if she actually thinks Diana should turn to be with Matthew.
I think it's both. I think that Isabeau, as a mother in the text, is trying to decrease the existential and also personal threat to her child. But I think that it's also to see whether she has the kind of personality, honestly, is she the anti-Blanca? Does she have enough of her own to maintain against Matthew's rather tidal tendencies? I think that Isabeau, after 1,500 years, has probably a really good read on the kind of creature that Matthew should be with. And if she suspects what Matthew and Hamish suspect about what's going on, then she is assessing worthiness by investigating those traits and seeing, is this a person who could actually survive being with Matthew like that? So I think it's a little bit of both. What about you?
I think so too. I think I concur. I agree with you. And we also have a lovely moment from Mart where she growls at Isabel.
Because Mart is the best and has consistently been the best. And then we have this, like, not terribly elegant foreshadowing. It's like, I had a lot to learn about vampires. This I knew. But who was going to teach me? And when? How about tomorrow when Isabeau kills things in front of you?
Mm-hmm. Let's go hunting.
Can I talk about side saddles really fast?
Yes, please do. We need some diversion. We need some diversion.
As you might have noticed in our real-time reading on this chapter, chapter 24, I go into a little bit of a digression about side saddles because they were actually factually invented to protect the virginity of a princess, because people thought that riding astride did naughty things to your hymen and that you would no longer be pure and you couldn't ensure a royal bloodline if you had been tainted. So side saddles exist to keep you from damaging lady parts.
Right.
And therefore I think they're ridiculous.
They are ridiculous. And when you first told me this, I was like, well, people then clearly had no idea how sex actually works. None at all. This sounds like it was made up by a bunch of virgins. Not that I have, like, being a virgin is not bad. It wasn't negative. I'm just saying, like, you can't become an unvirgin by riding a horse.
I think it was just people who did not inquire very specifically into the lady parts. Like, not a great understanding of anatomy. And it doesn't take someone who has never had sex to not have a great understanding of anatomy.
That's true. That's true. If you've all, ever heard of My Dad Wrote a Porno or read it.
Correct. Or just search the internet for when members of a different gender assigned at birth tried to label the parts of other people whose gender was assigned at birth, and they come up with all sorts of, like, really interesting things, including a circle, as I understand it, around the vaginal opening that says, "Here there be dragons."
Perhaps not the best understanding of female anatomy.
Dragons. Can we say the actual word for lady parts and keep our iTunes ready?
Probably not. The point is, side saddles prevented nobody from... They protected nobody's virginity.
True. So we discussed what we think this chapter is about a little bit before we started recording, and I think that this chapter is about Isabeau and Mart dealing with the fact that keeping Diana and Matthew apart is a lost cause.
Right. But I do have a question about that. Well, I agree with you that she's, like, come to terms with it. She's like, fine, but somebody needs to teach you some things.
Fine?
No, not fine. But, like, resigned. Yes, somebody's needs to teach you some things that clearly my son is not teaching you about vampires. Do we think, however, that this is the best time to do this? It's sort of like, oh yes, Diana, I know that you have been terribly traumatized and that we saved you from drowning yourself yesterday, but please come with me while I kill things in front of you.
Do I think it's the best time? No. Do I think that Isabeau believes that it's necessary to be like, no, if you're going to do this, like if you're going to really truly make this choice to be with my son, then there are going to be times when you are emotionally, physically, and otherwise vulnerable, and you have to put up with more trauma.
No, I think she believes it. I just...
No, obviously, none of this is ideal. But it's also, I mean, Diana has been, up until this point, so obtuse about the actual challenges. You know, the best thing that I can compare it to is that she has a certain amount of... and it's only because the most analogous word I can use is the idea of, like, privilege. Like, she is in a position where, because of her place in the world and what she understands about the world of creatures, as limited as it is, she hasn't actually factually thought through the physical, logistical, emotional difficulties of living with a creature that kills. Like, that kills with his own hands and teeth. And not just rabbits.
No. And she has been, as we've discussed several times, very cavalier about this in the past. So I do think it was a conversation. And maybe Matthew wasn't the best person to do it. Like, maybe Isabeau is the best person to do it. And, that's fine. Maybe the message gets across better because it's not Matthew.
We basically know that Matthew just starves himself to avoid having this conversation.
He does. He's not great at self-care, so...
And that's also, like, not a really healthy emotional response to the dark parts of you and the dark parts of, like, the parts of you don't want your partner to see. Like, starving yourself is not a great idea.
No. They're really, like, neither of them is great at taking care of themselves, as we've discussed. Was that last time? The previous time, where neither of them has good self-care habits. And we do mean self-care on like the Maslow's hierarchy, not self-care as in like bubble baths and manicures and champagne and things like that.
Correct. We mean like awareness of emotional triggers, the ability to withdraw from like painful, stimulating situations, like knowing what you need to be able to recharge your emotional batteries to be the best version of yourself you can, not mani-pedis and chocolate.
Right. But even like more basic than that, like food, shelter, security,
hydration,
sleep.
Like keeping your batteries charged. And that's not to say that for some people they can't have chocolate and mani-pedis be a way that they exercise self-care, but the fundamental principle being that you know what it takes to keep you running, that you don't deplete your own stores, whatever they may be.
There are levels to self-care, and neither of them are good at the basic ones. Does this chapter well, we have a little bit of a phone call. Do you want to talk more about hunting? Because I mean,
no,
like we just grade up the creatures that we kill to larger and larger creatures, and you're like, okay, well, guess that's that.
And some of that I will buy as like Isabeau being a malicious version of herself. Absolutely. Like I buy that she is to some extent trying to, like, a last ditch effort to get rid of this thing in her house. I will absolutely buy that. But yeah, I don't know that we need to read
clearly
too
she
deeply.
knows how to be like refined and, you know, civilized.
I think that she's fundamentally reminding Diana that there is a savage inside of Matthew that she hasn't reckoned with yet, and that there's a savage inside of every vampire, and Isabeau knows that she can control herself. Like, she has an extraordinary and almost like cruel degree of control, whereas we've demonstrated that Matthew's control is not great, and that's part of why he just exercises denial. Like, he can't find balance. He has to be completely denied or completely indulged.
Right. Yeah, as we talk about with Matthew's creation, you know, him just kind of like losing himself in people is not a new thing he's been doing for 1,500 years. So, and then we come back from hunting, we have a little phone convo, and that's about it. That happens in this chapter, right? Is there anything else you wanted to say about it?
Not really. I mean, I think that, as we've already said, like, these are some of the most difficult chapters for me, and I'm quite frankly rather glad that we're now through them and that we can move on to other things, because I just find them to be, some of it maybe is a necessary step in getting us to where these people need to be, but it's like showing me the worst version of this story in the process of getting to the best version.
I think that is all I have to say about it as well. Certainly, some of the things we've discussed, this is not the last time that we're going to be touching upon them, because they're going to be coming up again in this book. So, but at least now we've gotten like the brunt of the discussion out of the way.
So if you would like to at us about All Souls, which you're welcome to do, as we should point out, if anyone's still listening at this point, you are welcome to disagree with us. We welcome contrary and opposing opinions. We'd love to do another listener feedback episode sometime in January. So now that we're in 2018, let us know how you feel, what you think, and what's important to you with respect to these characters in this reading. We would love to know. So you can find us at chamomile and clovecast at gmail.com, and also at chamomile in as a November clove on Twitter.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. And I know sometimes Twitter can be a little bit spoilery, so if you want to email us instead, we check our email all the time, and we love getting emails from you guys. So
we love getting emails. It's the best part of my day.
Yes. And also thank you so much to those of you who have left us ratings and reviews on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever else you find your podcast. That helps other people to find us. And so if you have not done so, please consider leaving us a rating or review so that more people can find the podcast. We can build our All Souls community as we approach 2018 in the television show.
And in the meantime, we wish you a happy, safe, fruitful, and productive new year wherever you are. We love you, we're glad to have you, and we're glad to know you and glad to be a part of the All Souls community.
Yes,
so
indeed.
Thank you and Happy New Year.
Yes, and we will talk to you next time. Goodbye.
Bye.